Hey everybody, this is Leigh Hall from teachingacademia.com, and today we're going to be talking about this concept called thick description. And I'm going to be talking to you about what thick description is and giving you some examples of what a thick versus a more thin description looks like, and actually the benefits of making sure that you have both kinds in your field notes. All right, so let's dive right into this. What is thick description? Why does it matter? So the term comes out of anthropology, and you're going to have to forgive me because I've always struggled with how to say this gentleman's last name. It is attributed to Clifford. It's either Geertz or Gertz. It's Geertz. I always mix it up. Somebody always corrects me, and then I always forget. I'm sorry. But the idea here is when you're taking your field notes with thick description, you're going to be moving past a basic surface level in terms of your observations, your notes, and what you're writing down, what you are describing. Now, this idea of a surface level, those pieces of information are necessary and they have value, okay? But you don't want to only have surface level documentation in your field notes. There are moments when you are going to want to engage in this more thick description kind of work, okay? So with thick description, you want to include things like the context, detail, maybe content that's being, taught or examined at the moment, emotions, social interactions, things like that, all right? And these details help you and the larger community as a whole better understand your observation, okay? You may want to include direct quotes from others. Sometimes it's a sentence, sometimes it's a paragraph, okay? And you will use your best judgment, and that will be aligned with your research question, right? So obviously, if people are having a conversation and it has nothing to do with your research question, you don't need to document that, right? You might want to note that a conversation about a particular topic happened. That's an example of a more thin description. But a thick description isn't necessary because it's not related to your question. When you know, or you even think there's a possibility that you observed a conversation that does align with your research question, then you either want to document that in the moment, or if you're recording it, you're going to go back and transcribe it, right? Catch what you can in the moment and then clean it up later, all right? But that research question helps you understand what to take more and less of in terms of your field notes. So what does this thick description versus a more thin description look like? So let me give you an example here out of my background of education. So let's say I'm observing, an 8th grade English class, and a student that's in my study comes into the room and immediately walks over to his desk, sits down, puts his head down, and that's it, right? He's just sitting there with his head down, okay? If all I do is say, so-and-so came into the room, at 11 o'clock, went to his desk and sat down and put his head down, that's pretty thin. Now, it's important information, okay? So I'm not knocking this level of information because we do need to know the student came into the room. We do need to know, it was at the beginning of class, or maybe that student was 10 minutes late, right? That information is important. The fact that that person came over immediately and put his head down on the desk, that's very important, okay? That's all still very relevant, all right? But we're also missing some things, which we may or may not be able to get at that moment in time, okay? So we know the facts of what happened, what we saw, but what else is going on, okay? And it's when you start providing that context, right, that you start to shift from a thin into a more thick description. So, for example, some things that I could include in that scenario is what's happening in the class at the moment, okay? So, for example, if that student comes in the room and maybe there's an assignment on the board, maybe you have to come in and you have to turn in your homework and sit down and maybe do a quick writing in response to a question. And that student came in and didn't turn anything in and didn't do that opening quick write assignment, right? That's important information to know versus, the expectation was just come in and sit down in your seat, right? Those are two very different contexts, all right? And putting your head down when the context is just come in and sit down signals something potentially very different than, come in, turn in your homework from last night and do this other assignment, right? So that context is very important. It helps us start to get a handle on the situation and to know kind of what we might want to investigate later, either with the student or potentially that student's teacher. All right. So you might ask the student in that context, and it might be that day, it might be that week, it might be at an interview later on. You use your best judgment about when the best time is to have conversations like this with participants. You might ask that student to explain what they did. You might say, I noticed you came in, you got to class on time, but you didn't turn in your homework and you didn't do that opening quick write. I noticed you put your head down on your desk and you didn't look up until the teacher called your name. Can you talk about what was going on that day? Can you help me understand what it was that I saw? All right. That's getting at a more thick description. All right. The other thing that you might do in that situation is you might document how people react in relation to the student. So for example, the student comes in, right? We'll say it's that situation where you got to turn your homework in and do a quick write, but the student doesn't do that. He puts his head down on his desk. Does the teacher notice that pretty promptly and go over and have a discussion with that student? Do other students try to engage with this student? And if so, what happens? Or does everybody seem to kind of not say anything to the student, right? The student's just left alone by themselves and nobody's talking to that student. Is it 15 minutes before someone says something to that student, right? These are all very important contextual things to know that allow you to build up this thicker, richer description and allow you to move past those surface level observations, which are still very important because those are the facts of what you saw, right? But it helps us kind of get at what's the real underlying thing here, what's really going on. So some kinds of things that you may want to include in your thick description is, or in your descriptions in general, are biographical, who's involved, okay? Historical, what might have led to this. Now, when we're talking about what led to this, it could be that you're speculating, you have some ideas, you have some questions, in which case you probably want to put that in a separate spot on your field note form, or you may actually have some information, okay? In which case you can fill that in. The context, right? What's the situation, right? What's the environment, okay? Relational, what's happening at that moment, and then interactional, right? What, who's talking to who or who's not talking to who, right? What are and what are the meanings of those relationships and those interactions? You won't necessarily be able to get at what are the meanings of these interactions or lack thereof in that moment in time. But you can make notes. You can make notes to yourself. You can leave questions for yourself that allow you to backtrack later on to have conversations with the people involved so that you can get at understanding the meanings about the interactions that you saw or lack thereof.